Thank you, everybody, for joining. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone, for those in different time zones. The purpose of this panel is to highlight the lessons learned from the work, diversity, equity, and inclusion leadership. The last couple of years have seen tremendous interest and advancement of DEI in many organizations that are intent on creating a more inclusive and equitable work environment for their employees. So our discussion will allow our speakers to share their reflections on the journey of sustaining DEI commitment across organizations and the tech industry as a whole. As Maylene mentioned, my name is Belinda Nieves, and I oversee the HR function at WTIA. The goal of the discussion today is to hear from DEI leaders who have been in the execution phase of their DEI strategy and have important insights to share for us. We hope that you'll have something new to learn from this conversation, which may be applicable to the work that you're doing in your own organization. I'd like to introduce our panel representing organizations that have been part of the WTIA Anti-Racism in Tech Pact, which began in 2020 in response to the uprising about racial equity that spurred many organizations into action. First is Marcus Carter II. Marcus Carter is the director of DEI at First Tech Federal Credit Union, and he is an organizer, a teacher, a student, and a catalyst for social change. He is deeply invested in transforming the cultural, material, and systemic conditions of our social relations. In addition, he's the father of 3 superheroes. Next is Katie Donnelly. Katie Donnelly, PHR, is a global diversity and equity inclusion leader at Verizon, where she's responsible for driving DEI strategy throughout the enterprise. As a strategic partner to the business and human resources teams at Verizon, she identifies opportunities to embed and improve inclusive practices and behaviors throughout the employee lifecycle and business processes. Katie has over 20 years of experience in talent management, supplier diversity, human resources operations, and diversity and inclusion. Prior to joining Verizon, Katie also held management roles at Cigna and Aramark. Next is Danita Price. Danita joined Pioneer Services in August 2021 as the Director of Organization Development and Head Principal of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Justice, and Accessibility. Did I get that right? In May of 2022, her role expanded to include talent acquisition, which allowed the opportunity to lead and design Pioneer's end-to-end talent strategy. She's responsible for building, implementing, and the success of Pioneer's integrated talent readiness and DEI strategies designed to advance organizational capability and equity in service of our employees and communities we serve, all aligned with Pioneer's mission, vision, and strategic priorities. Danita also brings with her 20 years plus of progressive experience in navigating and strategically leading volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, VUCA, I believe is how the acronym is pronounced, organizations specializing in implementation and transformation using human-centered design and system thinking principles and methods. She is highly regarded as a strategic, visionary, and transformative tactical leader who focuses on enabling tangible people and business results while building highly collaborative working relationships across the organization and communities. Danita's 20-year career journey has taken her through several industries, human resources, aerospace manufacturing, nonprofit social enterprise, healthcare, technology, e-commerce, professional services, and hospitality. We also have joining us today is Leela Williams. Leela is the Chief Impact Officer for Evia, thank you. Yeah. Formerly TriDigital. She has over 25 years of experience in human resources, finance, and business administration fields. Leela began with Evia in 2006 when there were only 5 employees, and she was an active contributor to the growth of the organization. She worked tirelessly to create a progressive culture for employees that push the boundaries of the traditional Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 work model, and is a strong ally for equitable practice at Evia. Under her HR leadership at Evia, the company has received several workplace recognition awards, including being named as one of Seattle's 100 best companies to work for 3 years in a row, the prestigious When Work Works Award, and the best and brightest companies to work for. She also played a critical part in Evia's accomplishment of becoming Gender Equity Now certified. Does anybody have any questions or anything to add? Anything that I missed? We're good? Okay. So let's start talking about the questions and hearing from the panelists. So this work can be challenging with many demands and often very little time and resources to support the work. There was a recent article in Inc. pointing out burnout and turnover among chief diversity officers. Can you please share the most edifying aspect of your work as a DEI and what keeps you going?
Can you say the question one more time, please? I'm sorry.
Sure. This work can be pretty challenging with demands and often little time and resources to support the work. There was a recent article in Inc. pointing out burnout and turnover among chief diversity officers. Can you please share the most edifying aspect of your work as a DEI leader and what keeps you going?
I'll start. The part of, for me, is that human in the center of all of this, right? So it's that human-centered design. It's a human that's in the center. It's the commitment that we've made throughout. And what keeps me going is that the progress that we're making generation after generation, iteration also, not just generation, but the iterations that we've made within diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I understand that this is a journey, and it's to enjoy the journey, but to also recognize the milestones that we have. And that's the piece that gives me energy to pursue and to go to the next step, even if that means to pause for a moment and to understand what's happening. Regarding the burnout, it is pausing and taking a breath and connecting and reconnecting back to the mission that you're going for, the vision that you're going for. And that's for me, that's what keeps me going.
Thank you, Janita. Does anybody else have anything to add? Okay.
So
I think Katie's trying
going
to talk. Katie, your mic isn't on.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for recognizing that.
No problem.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Thank you, Lita.
All right, great. Thank you. What has helped me with burnout is really recognizing we have to meet people where they are and take the little wins. It might not be what you expected, but take the little wins and not put some wind in your sails. And also the fact is that you have to do what you need to do to take care of yourself somewhat. And what keeps me going is the fact that it's simply not okay for people to be treated differently and have less access, not as equitable options as any other group, because we don't have the choice of being born into the circumstances that we're born in. And as a white woman in DE&I, I will always leverage my privilege and the opportunity to take the bullets that other groups may not be able to take. And that's what keeps me going, is knowing like the impact that we're making incrementally in organizations.
Thank you, Katie. That was really insightful. Before we move on, I want to make sure no one else has anything to add.
I'll respond. So to circle back, EVIA is one of the only digital production companies that's women owned and led. So it's been our priority since day one to have diversity, equity, inclusion as part of our company. So our CEO, Hillary Laney, intentionally purchased the company to level the playing field for women in tech. So as you mentioned in my intro, we became Gender Equity Now certified, which you'll have to look it up. It's a really great thing. Another example is we've hosted field trips in our office to encourage girls and non-binary students to choose a path in STEM. and stick to that. And then we've also contributed to the evolution of accessibility at events. So, and I kind of wanted just to tie it back to what Danita said, it is about the journey and the work's never really done. And so that's what kind of just keeps me going, is seeing the progress, even if it's just little steps, that keeps me motivated.
That's really, really lovely. I like the idea of the field trips for the girls and non-binary children, particularly because as a Latina woman myself, I don't remember being exposed to anything tech related when I was, I want to say younger, let's just say young, when I was young.
Sure.
So before I ask the next question, I first want to start with acknowledging your organization's commitment to racial equity, evidenced by signing onto the Anti-Racism in Tech Pact. The tragedy of the murder of George Floyd and other unarmed Black people strengthened a movement that has gotten the attention of corporate America. Companies pledged more than $50 billion to advance racial equity in their organizations and the communities that they serve. Nearly 80% of workers in the most recent CNBC SurveyMonkey workforce survey say that they want to work for a company that values diversity, equity, and inclusion. Employees are demanding more accountability from leaders, with 60% of workers in the survey saying that they approve of business leaders speaking out on social and political issues. I know each of you has been in the throes of DEI work for many years. In your opinion, how has the conversation about DEI changed over the last couple of years since the racial reckoning of 2020? Marcus, I'd like to hear from you.
Yeah, happy to take this first. I think it's important, first and foremost, to say that no conversation we're having today is new, right? All of these things existed prior to 2020, and I say that to honor racialized, marginalized groups and individuals that have held their humanity to a high regard, right? And they've remained consistent in actually making sure that people knew better, right? That people know that they deserve, better, that we deserve better. And so it's important to just honor and highlight that this work has always existed. There's nothing necessarily new, even after 2020. The second element, just to highlight, and I think this is deeply underrepresented in these kinds of conversations, and it's taken me some time to identify this, but there is actually more noise today than there was prior to 2020, right? DE&I is an $8 billion industry, and we might ask, to who is it serving, right? There's so many good intentions. There's not enough agency and actual transformative impacts. By agency, I mean actually producing a particular effect, right? Changing outcomes, experiences, and actual intervention to homogeneous systems, structures, equity, and inclusive design. There's a lot of activity, right? Public statements, more studies to expose inequity, symbolic gestures, right? There's just limited adjustments to infrastructure and decision-making. And if there's $8 billion that exist on the table, again, who is that helping? To me, again, I think it's underrepresented that there actually has been more noise since 2020 than effective measures of change up into to this point.
So I really I'd like for you to share, how did you identify that there's more noise versus more action? Did you come to that conclusion in some sort of way, or did you have an epiphany, or how did you get there?
Yeah, a couple of things. One, we could all open up our LinkedIn profiles and see who's speaking, right? Everybody has a critique on whether it's race, whether it's what we should be doing as it relates to DE&I. And we can take a large percentage of that and say, that's actually not meaningful. Right. Some of these things, I've been a part of organizations where we're hosting many town halls and discussions on things we knew have existed, inequities in our society that have impacted our workplaces for days. And instead of producing an intervention to that, we'll take another 6 months to assess it, another year to assess. None of these ideas are actually new. And again, when I'm talking about the noise, I think we see the ways in which organizations claim to be doing this work. None of their numbers are impacted, right? If we are going to be evidence-based, right? Data-driven decisions, who are we building these interventions for? We look at surveys and we see how are DE&I programs faring in organizations. They're not faring with well with racialized and marginalized groups. Why aren't we adjusting it then? And so again, I think there is a significant amount of noise that we continue to navigate today. And again, it's underrepresented, but we hear that $8 billion. I can't actually name the different groups it's servicing at this point. That is the noise.
Thank you. I appreciate that clarification. I would be really interested, Danita, what your thoughts are around this as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcus, for the details of that. You know, for my journey within diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all the other access, justice, accessibility, all of that. Marcus is absolutely right in that this is nothing new, right? So the names have changed. What we call them have changed. The one part that I would love to see is a more structured, and I want to be fair to all organizations. First, let me say this. It looks different in each organization. I think that's the part that we sometimes miss. I just had a conversation where someone said, so when are we going to start doing DEI? And I said, we don't do DEI. DEI is an output too, right? So if you look at our organization, what we do is diversity, equity, inclusion, access. We provide access, there's accessibility. So I want to be fair to how large this is. As Marcus says, $8 billion. I say that it's actually more, if you look at it from a global perspective, that it's actually more than 8 billion, right? So it is DEI is a business, and the work of can be individualized to the organization, can be individualized to the communities of which those organizations serve, as well as, and I serve from a perspective of internally, as well as externally as well. So it's not just a one-way, two-way, it's a multi-way journey that we're on. It is the intersectionality, and to measure that, to measure the impacts of, it is tricky. How do you measure what's meaningful? What's meaningful to, if we're saying the intersectionality, and we want to have an impact on this community, every single community has a say of what impacts them. So that's the complexity of all of this and how you measure it. I don't want to say that we should all have one thing that we're going after, but you can look at organizations and you can possibly see where they believe or where they are looking for the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion to be. If you see where it falls within perhaps talent acquisition, and there's a heaviness on bringing in what one would say is diverse talent, again, that there's complexity within diverse, right? It's just so complex. For us, we are really focused on equity. Where are the gaps? And let's work to fill in those gaps. And within those gaps, that's where you have to have the understanding of that you are there to not necessarily fix, because your job may not be to fix, but it is to provide, to inform and educate, and provide resources if that's what your organization is about, right? So it's so complex. It's a business, and it is about business. So one has to really pause and understand what it is that their organizations are trying to accomplish through the lens or over the lens or with the lens of, and then really be structured around it. Even though that sounds non-human, because it's people sometimes want it to be flowy, but there's got to be some structure so that you can measure, because people are now looking for the outcomes and the measurements of the impacts.
So that leads me to a question for you. You said DEI looks different in every org. And I'm so sorry, I don't know why they're static. I apologize. You said DEI looks different in every org and that the measurements are tricky. Is there some thought around anybody in this panel with regards to what would help an organization start to define what DEI looks like for them, what they could tweak, who they would ask, how to go forward? Because it is a really complicated, complex And sometimes it seems just mammoth, right? Some people don't know where to start. The iceberg is huge. So is there some thought around, where do we start? How do we measure?
Before I turn it over, I just want to say that the tricky part, it may not be tricky for everyone, right? Depends on there's organizations. We're a nonprofit, a medium nonprofit. We don't have like people analytics or analytics that can pull the data, right? So it depends if you have the resources within your organization. From some organizations, it's not tricky. It can be defined if you have the resources, and I don't mean, it doesn't necessarily mean an additional headcount. It could just simply mean, do you have the tools and resources to measure, right? So I just want to make sure I say that. So I apologize. I'm not trying to throw a complete blanket over everything, but that's where it is. For us, the reason that I was so excited about diversity, equity, inclusion in our organization is that it sits with organization development, right? So we look at the organization as a whole, and it is looking at, first of all, defining the language so that we're all speaking the same language. What does diversity mean? What does equity mean? What are the definitions of, how do we use those? How do you tie that to your mission, your vision, and your core values? Hopefully it's within that, it's already built in that. If it's not, that may be a great place to start, but it is the language that we are all speaking so that when we talk, that we have the same language. And if not, then let's start there. Before you start to measure, before you start to change your systems and processes. And when you start to do that, you bring the organization along with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to weigh in?
I'll just say this, that there's a couple of things I'll try to be sure. Is like, one, we should not assume or position the function or nature of DE&I as being too complicated or too hard. And that's out of respect for the work that these organizations do, specifically in tech, right? People are very innovative, right? They're creating and figuring out how to solve for so many complex problems. And when we can't solve for our humanity, right, for how to treat one another more inclusive, more equitable, et cetera, then throw everything else away, right? We have to be able to innovate as it relates to how we build and sustain relationships as human beings. And so there's multiple, websites and resources out there that exist to like start your journey. And, everybody has to go about education and awareness. And, I was going to jump to, highlighting a couple of things. And then I said, wait, we know someone's strategic plan does not do the work, right? If you can't sit in sort of the education and awareness phase and get people to think about the problem differently moving forward, it's not going to be effective, right? You're going to be year over year saying, I thought we covered this in the first half of the year, and I'm still getting objections to why we're changing our recruiting processes. And instead, I'm getting like, we're still going to hire the best candidate, right? And so those type of microaggressions and things of that nature, all this to say, like, there's a certain measure and level of education and an awareness you have to sit in before you move to, actions and things of that nature. And again, I have been more critical myself to say, this work isn't as hard as people are making it out. That is actually working against the efforts many D&I practitioners are leveraging when people are saying, hey, it's too hard, because those who don't want to be involved, they get to lean on that, right? Like, I don't really get it. Stop it. You can go to the movie theater, watch the most complex, series, tell me all about it, the backstories and everything, right? And you can't figure out D&I?
All those Marvel movies and the characters, and yeah, you could keep up with that. Yeah. Leela, I'd be interested to hear from you as to how EVIA has moved forward in this area, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to answer the earlier question just about the changes, I mean, kind of what Marcus touched on is it feels performative in a lot of ways, the way that companies have done it, because they're like, oh, I just want to have a pat on the back to show that I'm, doing X, Y, and Z. But I have seen, small increases and changes in that, companies and employees are asking what's happening, what the plan is. They're having higher expectations of the organizations that they're working for, which is different, because I feel like that maybe wasn't always as out there for people. There's an increased level of accountability and transparency that is being asked as well. And just, I think on the data and analytics to inform progress, I do think you need to be able to put budget behind your talk and make sure that you can deliver on these things. But there's amazing tools. I mean, I'm getting on the regular emails from different people just in the area that are launching different DEI tools. It's out there. I mean, I think what's hard is that it tends to be people talk a lot, but they don't actually follow up and do the work. And it's not that, to Marcus's point, it's not that hard. The information's at our fingertips. So just do it, take the time, and it starts with yourself. You know, and I think that if you just have to get vulnerable and get down to business with yourself and learn and challenge your own beliefs, and you can kind of make progress. It's not that hard. You just have to do it. And not enough people do it. People just like their little comfortable areas, and they just want to keep it being in their position of power and live their nice, full life. And it's hard to get uncomfortable, but that's how growth happens. So I'm gonna get off my soapbox for a sec, but someone else can talk.
It's not a soapbox. No, I agree with you, but getting comfortable with discomfort is really, people make it out to be harder than it is, right? And so think about a task you have to do that goes larger and larger. Laundry is what comes to mind. Like, you put it off, and if you just would have done a couple loads, and I'm not minimizing DEI, but I'm just saying, if you just would have started small, you wouldn't have had the mountain of laundry that you look at on Saturday morning and you think, did that just move? I think it moved. I should have done this 2 weeks ago when it was actually not moving. So,
And
go ahead.
This is Katie.
Thank you.
I also think transparency is really critical in moving the needle in what's measured. Being transparent. We ask employees in the organization to share, respond to surveys, reporting out to those surveys, how we're doing. Also being completely transparent around your workforce data. We publish our workforce data in an annual report, our ESG report, and we have processes and strategies in place to improve those numbers, and recognizing that we don't have all the answers, but committing to moving the needle around giving the opportunity for the employee groups that we're challenged around, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. Yes.
Yeah, could I just add, because I love this point Katie brought up, and it's important, you know, for leaders who are, you know, listening to this call to highlight that you can not dictate, but how you engage in your level of transparency is reflected back, right? Because some organizations will say, hey, we need greater transparency from our employees, but they haven't provided that themselves as leaders. Right? What are you doing with this data? Right? What kind of insights are you hoping to pull? What is the roadmap? What is the plan? And so again, I think not to say that, you know, Katie, you said this, but I think some organizations have weaponized concepts around transparency. And you can still find reports today that will say, hey, I know specifically for women of color feeling like, they're not communicating all their microaggressions because they're aware of the ways in which they might be retaliated against, right? And we don't actually have caseloads of them winning those cases, right? We just don't, right? And so again, it's like the measure of transparency has to be afforded first and foremost in order to have that reflected. Whereas I see in organizations, this goes back to my conversation around noise and just activity, they'll have transparency as a value or something of that nature, right? But the embodiment, you know, the practice of that is missing, and there's an onus that employees are supposed to afford that first and foremost.
20 years in HR, and I will tell you, yep, that's just, I'm just going to vehemently agree with that. And we talked about to talent management. And I want to bring this up in question 3. In many organizations, DEI centered on talent management, which is an important aspect of the work. However, DEI is most effective when it's integrated into all of the business functions. I know Danita has touched on this. I know Marcus and Leela have both touched on this. Katie has also had some thoughts around this. What do you think is important for leaders across the organization to hone their understanding of DEI? We've talked about transparency. We've talked about a couple of other topics as well, but I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are as leaders.
It's a business strategy. It's not a nice to have. It's not a reaction to current events necessarily. That diversity makes us stronger. There's more innovation, there's faster problem solving. And the fact of the matter is that it's critical to any organization. And you have to have leaders that have skill sets around inclusive leadership, who are comfortable managing diverse teams, all of that. It's not a nice to have, it's not an option, it's a business strategy.
Yeah,
I could just add to Katie, I completely agree. So I plus one, Katie, and it's the art and science of a strategic plan. If you have a strategic plan that it is whatever the point is, diversity, equity, inclusion, access, accessibility, justice, belonging, is within every single one. And it doesn't have to read DEI. It simply just is. Right? It just simply is. That's the part where it is integrated into the organization. It is a part of the policy. It is a part of the structure. It's a part of the systems. It's a part of the strategic plans, where it reads as though this is a business thing that we're doing. Within that, it's the art of writing that so that it has an impact on diversity, equity, inclusion, access, accessibility, justice, whatever you are focused on. And so that's the OD part where and then you can have absolutely a standalone where it is explicit to DE&I alone, but all the other ones have got to have an impact on one of those, or else it's just a standalone. It sits there. It's like when human resources at one time, it was human resources could just simply be over here, right? So DEI, if it's not within, right, it's not integrated. If it's so hard to unwind from the organization, it's hard to say, let's deprecate it, let's get rid of it. Oh, the money's dried up, or whatever the case may be. If it's in the actual financials, if it's of how we accomplish, again, it's the inputs to get to the outputs. It's to be efficient so that we can be effective. So when you can put it in your financials, something that you cannot not have, right? As an organization, that's whether you're for profit or nonprofit, it just depends on how you put it on your line. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, at Verizon, our DE&I strategy centered around the 4 stakeholders that our CEO identified. And he views them all equally important. It's our employees, our customers, society, and our shareholders. So we embed everything around those 4 stakeholders in our business processes, procedures, our talent acquisition, management. We just had an equity report done, but that's how we're able to get the engagement that we get within the organization, because they understand we're building upon the strength of our diversity and our equitable processes, procedures, policies. And there's more room for improvement, but everything that we do around those 4 stakeholders is embedded in everything.
And I wanted to add to that too. At EVIA, we incorporated this a couple of years ago, but as every company, we have annual goal setting, right, that takes place every year. And so we decided to incorporate an IDEA goal, which, is adding another acronym in there, but inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. And so essentially everyone on the team has to pick something that they're focused on. And it's one tangible thing that if you're struggling as a small business, or you don't have the resources or whatever, make it part of your goal setting that has to do with the business and how it supports the business. And then that way progress is sort of tracked, throughout the year and shared broadly. And it holds all employees accountable to this, which has been, I think it's been a big success.
So is that IDEA goal that you're talking about at EVIA transparent in that everybody can see what everybody else's goals are. And so everybody holds everyone else accountable. And
exactly. Yep. We have it all. We have a tool that we use, that tracks all this, and everyone at the company is expected to meet with their managers regularly on their goals. We have quarterly reviews of it. And at the end of the year, so yes, it's out there. It's not hidden behind some paper that gets filed away.
So that leads me, that's a beautiful segue, Leila. It's almost like you planted it right into question 4. The question 4 is, what are the top 3 things that companies can do to enhance an inclusive culture? And you led off with the idea goal and its transparency and its accountability with everyone in the company, which also means that you can go to someone in the company and say, I'm struggling. I have this goal, but I think you eat an elephant one bite at a time, and this is maybe a whole herd. So I'm struggling. Can someone please help me out and maybe parse this out into much smaller bites? Can you speak to other things that EVIA does that?
Yeah, I mean, these are, I have a little list here in my notes, but the 3 things for me that companies can do, really, I think you need to listen, but through a self-awareness lens. It's not, I'll just leave it there. Be mindful, acknowledge when you've caused harm, and do better. I mean, it's hard to be in that space, but like I've said already, you have to do the work. It starts with self. And I think that unless you can get over yourself, you're not going to get very far. And then my third one is just lead with compassion and empathy. I don't think that happens enough in business. And I think you can get pretty far if you keep that as your focus. So I don't know. Let's turn it over to someone else if anyone wants to add anything.
Sure, Katie.
I think it's really important to allow employees to be vulnerable and have leaders be vulnerable and give them the tools to have these conversations around awareness. Start off with good intent and assume good intent. Also, assessing your organization around where there's opportunities to be better, and then getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. That's been a huge shift at Verizon, where we've been having conversations and you're giving people the tools that they need to expand their awareness of different people, expand their awareness of different cultures, expand their awareness of the barriers in processes within talent management or any other type of processing, and encourage curiosity as well.
I like your getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, but it's also a skill that is particularly difficult to teach for a whole host of people. If people, I'm going to pick on myself. If you're in human resources, you spend a lot of time in discomfort for a whole host of things, and probably because people can come up with creative ways to do something that you think, wow, I didn't realize that was a thing. So how is the best way to teach our employees to get comfortable with being uncomfortable? Is it creating a safe space? Is it vulnerability? I'd like to hear some thoughts around that, please.
It's about creating safe spaces. We also have developed toolkits where leaders and employees can leverage having conversations within their groups. Also, having a policy around retaliation, that's not okay. During the George Floyd murders, we had very senior leaders having conversations with their organizations that they never thought they would have. They were extremely uncomfortable, and I coached several of them. They were embarrassed about not being aware of their privilege. They were embarrassed that they thought we were further along as a country, and they were afraid of saying the wrong thing. And if you open with that vulnerability, people will give you grace. And that's where you get the great conversations going, where people are vulnerable, sharing what they need, all of that.
I have a couple ideas, and I think it's important to highlight this. because again, like everybody on this panel, we've been on different discussions, and I feel there's a need to like uphold specific experiences that are marginalized. And so one, I love the idea of, assume good intent. And again, this is not to you, Katie, it's just a common thing. People say this, but I feel like that's often weaponized, right? Because the reality is these systems prioritize the safety of certain groups. So it's not a measure of individually or interpersonally assuming good intent. It's like the system in itself is still protecting certain groups over other groups. And so there's not much value in underrepresented groups assuming good intent when they are ultimately harmed if they are to bring forth, a concern. And so I think it's important to say that. I think it's also important to highlight that when we talk about safe spaces, again, that safety is usually prioritizing overrepresented groups or the homogenous group. And then I've also heard people talk about brave spaces, and I feel like that further marginalizes the efforts, racialized and marginalized groups have had to even exist in these spaces, a deep, deep amount of, being brave, being courageous. And so some of the alternatives I've heard is just like, how do we have more accountable spaces, right? How do we make sure that you are taking ownership of your impact and not just leaning on, good intentions, if you will. And so I think it's important for that. And then, as it relates to the conversation of people being uncomfortable in conversations, some of us really need like deeper context for perspective and just like historical context. Respectfully, I think I do a good job holding discussions in which I'm trying to remove barriers of connection for people. I'm also trying to make sure that there's space for people to contribute. And I'm also thinking about like, what are the barriers to equity? But most importantly, if you can't have a discussion in which there is conflict and tension, that's a deeper dive, right? Some people are just having conflict and tension in a 45-minute discussion at work. Other people got to live the rest of their lives, day to day, moment to moment, in measures of abuse, interpersonally, systemically, et cetera, right? And so that's a completely different dynamic. I'm not trying to not honor the different contradictions we all deal with, but I do think there's a ways in which in the workplace we've used this idea that people have to get this be uncomfortable. People have been uncomfortable their whole life and they're still showing up, they're still producing, right? They're still doing phenomenal things, and that's under much larger systemic measures. And so again, I just feel is necessary, on these platforms to infuse some of these conversations with that, because that's part of the reason we had 2020, right? Was nobody actually wanted to address some of these core root things. And now we have a moment to have town halls for people to say things that people have been saying forever and a day. And so again, I think it's important to highlight those things, like +1 to everything that's been saying, but there's a different dynamic that is never discussed in these conversations. And if we all go to our organizations, I'll guarantee there's people who are like, yeah, if we would have pointed out this would have meant a lot more for me, right? I would have felt seen. I would have felt validated. I'd have felt supported and connected. And that would have enabled me to be at that organization longer. But instead, my experience of being marginalized, of being pushed to the side and saying this wasn't going to be honored, et cetera, that's the reason why, I left, if you will. And so again, I just felt it was important to highlight that.
That's wonderful feedback. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with the panel and the summit as a whole. Danita, I'm going to pick on you for a bit and ask what your thoughts are around some of the top 3 things that companies can do, or you can actually add additional information from what Katie and Marcus just shared.
Yeah, I think, again, the top 3 things that companies can do, first of all, it depends on the company. I think that's my old HR head. I think that anyone in HR, I think that's our go-to. It depends. It really depends on the organization. You cannot take the overall blanket and apply. You have to do the work to understand your organization, who your organization says that it's going to be or is, and then do that. And then do the work to do that and to be that, right? The part that I will say that we're at Pioneer, that we really are guided by our core values. And within our core values, we have a core value that I really appreciate, which is lead with compassion. and that states, and I'm reading it so I don't mess it up, is we believe empathy and accountability go hand in hand. It is about understanding, but it is that accountability piece that Marcus talked about, right? And so in the conversations of meeting people where they are, is to understand and hold. That is the force multiplier. It is the ands versus the ors. And then have the understanding, the empathy to say, I don't know, right? I don't know. And then you move forward from there. Going back to the complex piece, this is the complexity that I was talking about. We're talking about humans. We're talking about human emotions, experiences, and we're talking about history. And we're talking about how someone feels at work. This is people's livelihood. And so they may show up different than they would if this was not at work. And the conversations may sound different. So the respect of that, of people who don't even want to be a part of these conversations. Look, I just want to come to work, do my job, go home, and have respect for that person to not be so in depth. And then there's the other person who is really wanting to get in. And I'm not talking about just the DEI officers and directors. I'm talking about employees that are within, but also have the respect for employees who I want to come to work, do the best job that I can, and then go home. And then I can demonstrate how I want to show up in this area outside of work. That's also one thing that I would say that companies also need to recognize, that there are employees who may explicitly say that, and some that may not, because of just not the fear, that's a really heavy word, but again, it goes back to, I just want to come to work and just do my job and go home. So also having just recognition of that too as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. We also don't know what people are dealing with in the post-COVID social injustice, racial injustice, politics, whatever is happening with their families, people who are in the sandwich generation who are taking care of kids and their parents. There's other things that our employees are dealing with that are heavy, and they just want to come to work, do their job, and work on whatever they're doing in their personal lives. So that's a really great point to highlight. Thank you. Any other thoughts before I move on to the last question? So last question, to successfully lead DEI work, it's important to create and sustain a culture of belonging and a sense of purpose among those employees who really care and are invested in seeing real transformation in their workspaces. What advice do you have for DEI advocates who want to see meaningful change in the culture of their organization, and taking into account Danita's comment that it depends on the organization? You know, not all organizations are built the same. So what advice would you give?
I'll start. I think DEI advocates, is that the word you use? They need to be consistent, but don't try to do it all. Even micro changes, I think, can have an impact. Also, just be ready for continuous learning. And as I've heard recently, the term unlearning, there's a lot of that has to happen. I think that's something just worth mentioning, and just speak up. Have tough conversations and put yourself out there. If you see something happening, don't just stand by, especially if you're in a position of power and privilege. It's your job to do that and to speak up. So those are my little nuggets.
And also, I think it's important to recognize that even within one organization, different business units have different cultures. And you have to be flexible around engaging the different cultures, but anchoring it all back to the same values, the same strategy, the same mission.
That is a really wonderful point. There are subcultures within the organization's larger culture, and they're based on a whole host of things that we may not always be aware of.
And they're all at different levels around their understanding, their importance of it. They have different reasons for wanting to engage. We have 126,000 employees in 4 different business units, plus a corporate function, and they're all in different spots. And you just have to be flexible and meet them where they are and not try to force your thoughts, your perspective on them, and really allowing them to leverage you with your experience and your tools the way they need it.
Yeah, I would add real quick, and actually, Danita, I think you were going to go, so I can go after you. You good?
I was just going to talk about cultures and subcultures, right? So within organizations, understanding the cultures and then subcultures, and especially in tech, you can have a culture that is heavily defined, as we have big tech organizations and small tech organizations. There's a definition and an understanding of this is our culture, but then there's subcultures. You can have subcultures of engineers and scientists have a different culture and different subculture. Just our ERG groups, those are subcultures within the organization. The expectation that those cultures want and what they would like to see the organization do around this. So just to be aware that there's a culture that's defined, but there are also subcultures as well. Thank you, Marcus.
Yeah, love that point. I think what I would highlight for advocates, and I'm assuming in this case, advocates aren't, practitioners. And this is kind of reminiscent of a panel I was on earlier this year in the tech industry and talking about how to combat systems of oppression in tech. And my call out was, you do that by combating systems of oppression in society, right? Thinking about 2020, right? Our workplace changed because of larger social systemic injustices that are actually reflected in inequities we see, in the workplace. And so sometimes the advocate wants things to change immediately, points out the inequity and then just like, why can't we just change? I see it. It's like, clearly I've been seeing it as well, right? There's other steps that are needed, that have to happen here. And so, engage in your community and see how hard it is to actually create, change. How difficult it might be to point out, inequities and things of that nature, and get people to like consciously think about the problem or the issue differently. It takes a lot, right? Respectfully, right? Like we all have the different ways we've seen our organizations move, but like that's not easy, right? And so again, I think there are many ways in which, advocates, I love the support, I love the help. And it does take time, unfortunately, when you're thinking about what systems of oppression and what kind of interventions are we trying to plug and play, that takes time. And I never want us, and I'm sure we've all had this experience, in which the advocate now becomes, you're holding their labor, right? They're the ones who are now, making you the end of the work. You're like, well, I thought we were on the same team here. And so again, it's like, take a step back, right? Engage in different communities, and you'll see it's not actually easy to try to achieve a measure of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I always try to highlight, as long as those things are optional, that should inform you about the current state we're in, right? As long as those things are optional, that informs you about the current state we're in. And so again, it does take a significant amount of work and investment, on our end.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We're coming up close to the end of time, I believe. Are there any final thoughts that any of the panelists want to add? Anything that I may have, may have wanted to elaborate on?
Just one thing for me is don't stop, don't give up. Take a moment to rest, take care of yourself. This is mental work. This is physical work. This is, as I call it, this is full body work. Take the time that you need, lean on your resources, step away for a moment and come back, but never give up, because this is all of us, regardless of how one identifies. This is humanity. It's hard because humanity can be hard. We're talking about humans and systems and ecosystems and legislation and capitalism and all the things, right? So all the things is about this. And we're at work. This is livelihood, right? And so lay that on top of it too, but don't give up.
Thank you. That's a very beautiful way to end this panel. I sure appreciate that. Marcus, Leila, Danita, Katie, thank you for joining us. And I'm going to turn it back over to Maylene.